Hi everybody, welcome to my YouTube channel Dr. Srinivas Medical Concepts and my FB page Dr. Srinivas Concepts. This is Dr. Srinivas, neurologist from Andhra Pradesh, India. I am also the medical author of the book Focused Neurology. Today we are going to talk about a very interesting topic, the brainstem reflexes. The brainstem reflexes and the evaluation of the brainstem reflexes at the bedside. So, bedside evaluation of brainstem reflexes. But what are the components of the brainstem? Brainstem we have midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata. So, what are the reflexes we are going to elicit in the midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata? The reflexes which we are going to elicit in midbrain are the pupillary reactions. So when we elicit pupillary reactions, we can assess the midbrain activity. Second, we check out on the spontaneous eye movement, oculocephalic reflex and corneal reflexes for the evaluation of pons. For medulla oblongata, we check out on the gag reflex and the various respiratory patterns affecting midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata. So if we go systematically, the evaluation of midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata at the bedside, we'll be able to find out whether the brainstem is affected or not. If affected, which part of the brainstem is affected. So a systematic analysis and evaluation of brainstem reflexes at the bedside. So first we'll see the midbrain. Midbrain, we assess and evaluate the midbrain by looking at the pupillary size, the pupillary reaction to the light. Normally the pupillary size is 2.5 to 5 millimeters. The normal pupillary size is 2.5 to 5 millimeters. If the pupil is dilated more than 5 to 6 millimeters, we call that as a dilated pupil. The pupillary dilatation is done by sympathetics. The pupillary constriction is done by parasympathetic, which runs on the third nerve. So if the pupil is dilated, either the sympathetic system is stimulated or parasympathetic system is inhibited. So when the pupil is dilated, the parasympathetic fibers which traverse superficially on the third nerve gets affected. It can get affected directly because of a midbrain lesion or a herniation like uncal herniation coming and compressing the third nerve which runs in the midbrain. So a compressive lesion like uncal herniation will first affect the pupillary fibers because they run superficially on the third nerve. So pupillary asymmetry is the earliest sign in parasympathetic fiber of the third nerve compression. If it is an intrinsic lesion of the third nerve like diabetic third nerve palsy, the pupillary fibers are the last to get affected, or sometimes it may not get affected because they are placed superficially on the third nerve, whereas an intrinsic diabetic third nerve palsy will affect the central part of the third nerve and therefore spares the superficial part of the third nerve, that is the parasympathetic fibers. So what are all the manifestations of the third nerve palsy? 4 Ds. Dilatation of the pupil because the parasympathetic fibers are getting affected. Drooping of the eyelid because the levator palpebrae superior gets affected. Divergent squint because the medial rectus is affected. The sixth nerve will overact. Because of that there is double vision. So divergent squint, drooping of the eyelid, double vision and dilatation of the pupil. So if there is a compressive lesion of the third nerve like herniation, uncal herniation, the pupillary fibers are the first to get affected, the parasympathetic fibers of the third nerve. So the pupillary dilatation is the earliest. The other manifestations of third nerve will appear later. Whereas if it's an intrinsic third nerve palsy like a diabetic third nerve palsy, there will be other third nerve manifestations, namely drooping of the eyelid, divergent squint and double vision. The pupil may get affected last or it may be spared also. That's why it's sometimes known as pupillary sparing third nerve palsy of diabetes. Then pupil can get dilated also by sympathomimetic drugs. What we use it in ophthalmology to examine the fundus. So mydriatric eye drops. And very important, we have noticed that in brain death, pupils are dilated, fixed and non-reacting to light. Pupils are dilated, fixed and not reacting to light. Here the question comes. The pupillary dilatation is done by sympathetic. The pupillary constriction is done by parasympathetic. So, after death, both the sympathetic and parasympathetic should get affected, and therefore the pupil should be in the mid-size. But then, what we see clinically is that after death, the pupil is dilated. So, what is the mechanism? The mechanism is that though sympathetic and parasympathetic control the pupillary size, the parasympathetic has got more control over the pupillary size than sympathetic. And therefore, after death, though the parasympathetic and sympathetic gets affected, since the parasympathetic has got more control over the pupil than sympathetic, the parasympatholytic manifestations are more seen. That is, pupil is dilated. So, pupil is dilated after death. It is not in mid position. It is dilated after death because the pupillary size is more controlled by parasympathetic rather than sympathetic, and therefore after death, when the parasympathetic gets affected, the constriction of the pupil done by parasympathetic is gone, therefore the pupil is dilated. So, pupil is dilated after death. It is not in the mid position. So, the causes of the dilatation of the third nerve is the dilatation of the pupil is third nerve palsy, mydriatric eye drops and brain death. The small pupils, so we saw the dilated pupils, the small pupils less than 2.5 millimeters, we see in thalamic hemorrhage. As I said in the early part of my lecture, pupillary dilatation is done by sympathetic, pupillary constriction is done by parasympathetic. So, the sympathetic fibers originate from the hypothalamus, which is just underneath the thalamus. So, when there is a thalamic hemorrhage, the hypothalamus gets affected, the sympathetic fibers get affected. So, in thalamic hemorrhage, the pupil is small, myotic pupil, less than 2.5 millimeters. And then, very interesting, we see small pinpoint pupil, less than 1 millimeter size in pontine hemorrhage. Here again, a question arises. Why in pontine hemorrhage both the pupils should be constricted, should be small size, and why not in midbrain and why not in medulla oblongata? Because the sympathetic fibers run from midbrain, pons and medulla and goes downwards. So it goes in all the three parts of the brainstem, but why only pons causes bilateral small pinpoint pupil? Why not midbrain? Why not medulla oblongata? The answer is that both the sympathetic tracts, bilateral sympathetic tracts should get affected to cause bilateral small pupils. The midbrain is supplied by two posterior cerebral arteries. One posterior cerebral artery on one side of the midbrain, the other posterior cerebral artery on the other side of the midbrain. Likewise, medulla oblongata is also supplied by two arteries, the two vertebral arteries. So, the two vertebral arteries in the medulla oblongata or the two posterior cerebral arteries in the midbrains to get affected and cause both the sympathetics to get affected is very unlikely. But pons is supplied by a single artery, the basilar artery, and therefore when there is a basilar artery rupture, it goes to the both sides of the pons and bilateral sympathetic tracts fibers get affected, and therefore you have bilateral small size pupil. So very interesting, very important concept. We get bilateral small pinpoint pupils only in pontine lesion, pontine hemorrhage, because pons is supplied by a single artery, a single basilar artery, whereas midbrain is supplied by two posterior cerebral arteries, medulla oblongata is supplied by two vertebral arteries. So both to get affected and both to get affected and then affect the sympathetic, both the sympathetic tracts is unlikely. So we see bilateral small pinpoint size pupils in pontine hemorrhage, not in midbrain, not in medulla oblongata. Good? Right. Now let's come to the pons. Pons we assess by three components. One, the spontaneous eye movements. Second, the oculocephalic reflex. Third is the corneal reflex. Spontaneous eye movements. Thalamic hemorrhage. Thalamic hemorrhage is close to midbrain, and therefore it can go and impinge on the top of the midbrain, and therefore the sympathetic fibers can get affected and the eyes may turn downwards. It is primarily seen in thalamus and midbrain, but if it extends, then it can be seen in the other parts of the brainstem also. The second important spontaneous eye movement is eye looks towards the hemispheric side and away from the brainstem lesion. We have the horizontal eye movements in PPRF, para-median pontine reticular formation. Example, right PPRF, it connects sixth nerve on the same side, lateral rectus, and through MLF, medial rectus on the opposite side. So when the PPRF is activated, it pulls the eyes towards its side. So PPRF is in the pons. This is initiated by frontal eye fields on the opposite side. For example, left frontal eye fields area number 8. So left frontal eye fields area number 8 comes, descends between the midbrain and pons and goes to the PPRF on the opposite side. So when the left frontal cortex or the right pons is stimulated, the PPRF on the right side is stimulated, so eyes will be pulled towards the right side. So when the left frontal cortex is stimulated, the eyes should move to the right side. So when left frontal cortex is affected, eyes cannot move to the right side, eyes will be looking towards the side of the lesion. When the PPRF on the right side is affected, eyes cannot be pulled towards its side, eyes will move away from the site of the lesion. So that's the maxim. Eyes looks towards the side of hemisphere. So left frontal cortex cannot push the eyes towards the right side, eyes will move to the left frontal cortex and away from the brainstem lesion. Right PPRF gets affected, right pons gets affected, eyes cannot be pulled to the right side, eyes will be pushed to the left side, away from the brainstem lesion. Ocular bobbing. Ocular bobbing is a brisk downward movement followed by a slow upward movement with loss of horizontal eye movements. We classically see this in pontine lesions. Ocular bobbing, brisk downward movement, slow upward movement with loss of horizontal eye movements. We classically see it in the etiology of thrombosis of basilar artery. So when there is a thrombosis of the basilar artery, classically it can produce ocular bobbing, brisk downward movement, slow upward movement of the eyes with the loss of horizontal eye movements. Ocular dipping occurs in the cortical lesions where there is slow downward movement with a brisk upward movement but presence of horizontal eye movements because PPRF is intact. Right, this is about spontaneous eye movement. Oculocephalic reflex. What is this oculocephalic reflex? When the head is turned to one side, left side, the eyes will go to the right side. It is a normal reflex mechanism known as doll's eye movement. We as children would have played with the doll's eye movement. When we turn the head of the doll to the right side, the eyes will go to the left side. When we turn the head of the doll to the left side, eyes will go to the right side. Likewise, when we turn the head to the left side, the endolymphatic fluid gets stimulated in the left vestibule. It will connect to the PPRF on the opposite side. So PPR will pull eyes towards its side. So when the head is turned to the left side, the left vestibular apparatus is stimulated, which stimulates the right PPRF and eyes move to the right side. This is normal. So whenever we turn the head to the left side, the eyes will move to the right side. But again the question comes, but in a conscious person, it is up to us to look wherever we want. When we turn the head to the left side, I can move my eyes still to the left side. How is this possible? Because this normal oculocephalic reflex is inhibited by the intact frontal lobe. Frontal lobe can inhibit this reflex. And therefore, in a conscious patient, we should not elicit this reflex because frontal lobe can inhibit this. Only in comatose patient where the frontal lobe gets, so frontal lobe inhibits this reflex. Only in an unconscious patient, as the conscious comes down, this reflex becomes manifest. So we elicit this reflex in a comatose patient. When we put cold water it will inhibit the oculocephalic reflex. So this vestibular apparatus will overstimulate and then the eyes will move towards the same side. But frontal lobe also tries to push the eyes to the opposite side by connecting to the PPRF, and therefore we get a compensatory nystagmus to the opposite side. So both the vestibular apparatus and the frontal cortex will connect to the opposite PPRF. For example, left vestibular apparatus, left frontal cortex connects to the PPRF on the right side, will try to push the eyes to the right side by stimulating PPRF on the opposite side. So in the left, when the cold water is put, this is inhibited, this will overact and push the eyes to the same side, but left frontal lobe will try to stimulate the PPRF and will try to push the eyes to the opposite side. We get a compensatory nystagmus. So cows, cold opposite, warm same. So if there's the slow movement is affected, that means there's a problem in the pons, a defective pons. If the compensatory nystagmus is defective, that means there's a problem in the frontal lobe, defect in the frontal lobe. Another important point is that we should not try to elicit oculocephalic reflex in persons with the spinal cord injury, because when we try to elicit the oculocephalic reflex and move the head vigorously, we may worsen the spinal cord injury. Right. Next is the corneal reflex. The afferent is the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve, efferent is the bilateral seven nerves. So when we touch the cornea, the wisp of cotton, both the eyelids close. So if the corneal reflex is absent, that is fifth or seventh nerve gets affected, that means the pons is affected, because 3 and 4 nerves are in the midbrain, 5, 6, 7, 8 are in the pons. So if 5 and 7 are affected, pons is affected, corneal reflex will be absent. Medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata we test by gag reflex. The afferent is the 9th nerve, efferent is 10th nerve. When we touch the posterior part of the soft palate, we are stimulating the 9th nerve. So it connects the 10th nerve, and 10th nerve is motor, 9th nerve is sensory, 10th nerve is motor. There is a constriction of the pharynx and the elevation of the palate and uvula. So person will try to gag. It's a protective reflex. So the gag reflex is absent, that means medulla oblongata is affected. So midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata can be assessed by these brainstem reflexes. All these parts of the brainstem, midbrain, pons, medulla and cortex, can be simultaneously evaluated at the bedside by looking at the respiratory pattern. With just respiratory pattern, we can localize the lesion. For example, if the lesion is in the cortex, they'll have change-Stokes respiration. They take hyperventilation, then no ventilation, apnea, then hyperventilation. This is perhaps because of the hyperventilatory drive due to overstimulation of by carbon dioxide. That is cortex. When it comes to the midbrain, we have central neurogenic hyperventilation. Patient will hyperventilate. So if you find that kind of respiratory pattern, central neurogenic hyperventilation, that means the midbrain is affected. If this pons is affected, how do we evaluate pontine lesion or pontine function by respiratory pattern? If pons is affected, they will have apneustic breathing. They take a deep inspiration, hold for 2 to 3 seconds and then expire. Take a deep inspiration, hold for 2 to 3 seconds and then expire. This is known as apneustic breathing. Apneustic breathing is very characteristic of pontine lesions. So it's one of the important multiple choice questions also. Where do we find apneustic breathing? The answer should be pons. And when it comes to medulla oblongata, the breathing pattern is totally chaotic, irregular, what we call it as Biot's breathing. So just looking at the respiratory pattern, we can assess the axis of the brainstem, entire axis of brainstem, starting from midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata, including the cortex. So imagine there's a subdural hematoma coming and compressing from the cortex to the midbrain, pons, medulla. We can see the nice respiratory patterns evolving. When the hematoma is at the level of the cortex, they'll have change-Stokes breathing. When it comes to the midbrain, they'll have central neurogenic hyperventilation. When it descends down to pons, they'll have apneustic breathing. When it descends down to medulla oblongata, they'll have Biot's breathing. So by just looking at the respiratory pattern, we can tell where the lesion is. That is the joy of clinical neurology. We don't need all kinds of sophisticated investigations also to diagnose these conditions. They may complement us, but most important is the bedside diagnosis. the bedside clinics, the joy of clinical neurology. If you are good in clinical neurology, we can diagnose with just a bedside evaluation itself. The investigations, imaging will just complement our diagnostic process. So this is an overview of brainstem reflexes, the bedside evaluation of brainstem reflexes, the joy of clinical neurology. I hope you have enjoyed listening to my lecture. If you have any suggestions or comments, kindly post onto my YouTube channel. But please like and subscribe my YouTube channel, Dr. Srinivas Medical Concepts, and my FB page, Dr. Srinivas Concepts. Thank you. Bye.